Well, good morning, brothers.
Good morning. Good morning.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Good way to kick off the new year, isn't it? To meet together as Masons, and it's a pleasure for me to be here. I want to offer my thanks to you, Worshipful Master, for allowing me to make a presentation in your lodge. And I just want you to know that this is an event that I've been looking forward to. We're going to talk about the meaning of the ritual that we use in opening and closing a lodge, and it's one that I think has some particular meaning, and I've been looking forward to making this presentation. So I thank you for your invitation, and I thank you for letting me be here. I should begin by making it very clear to everybody, I don't speak for any lodge, I don't speak for any body of Masons. I think it'll be abundantly clear by the time we leave. I certainly don't speak for any Grand Lodge. The views that I'm going to offer you this morning are just my views. They are ones that I have developed from 40 years of closely observing Freemasonry. And there's nothing that we're going to talk about this morning that's intended to embarrass or insult or belittle any Mason or any group of Masons. So it's going to be a little straight talk among friends. Now, Masonic ritual operates on two levels, the exoteric and the esoteric. The exoteric is that which is obvious. It's the things that we can see and the things that we can hear. The esoteric is below the surface, and the esoteric meanings are revealed only on closer examination. And we're going to take just a few minutes this morning to look at the exoteric, or the surface meanings of opening and closing the lodge, and then the esoteric, some of the hidden meanings, if you will, although they're hidden in plain sight, I would suggest. So every Masonic lodge conducts a ritualistic opening ceremony before transacting any business. And that ceremony is brief. And in fact, this morning, you opened this lodge, and Worshipful Master, you opened your lodge in fine form. It took 6 minutes and 45 seconds. That's a very brief ceremony. Because of its brevity, the importance of the ceremony is often overlooked. In some instances, and I know everybody in this room has heard this at some point in time, we consider the opening and closing rituals as an annoyance. It's something that we rush through. We try to get it over with. Our attitudes towards the opening ceremony and our corresponding closing ceremony tell us a lot about the extent to which we've really engaged in the practice of Freemasonry. The opening ceremony has a specific purpose, and it's seldom appreciated and it's seldom understood. Now, to be fair, one of the reasons for that is we have become desensitized to it. If you've been in lodge for any period of time and you've seen the opening ceremony and the closing ceremony, it has become routine to us. And as it becomes routine to us, we sort of lose our sensitivity to actually what it means. I think that explains sometimes why we approach it in a routine or a lackluster way. But there are 4 things that happened this morning when we opened the lodge. In that 6 minutes and 45 seconds, there are 4 very important things that happened. The first of which is we sealed the lodge. The master, the senior warden, the junior deacon, and the tiler all engage in these little conversations. We determine that the men who are in the lodge are in fact entitled to be here. That those of us who are here this morning are allowed to be here. We're lawfully here. We have sealed ourselves from the profane world. We have set ourselves apart. We've separated ourselves. That process is sealing the lodge. There is a portion of our ceremony, and by the way, it's a much more distinct portion in the entered apprentice degree than it is in the master mason degree. But there's a portion of our ceremony where the officers define their duties. They talk about why we're here and what their job is. Some of the officers define what other officers' jobs are. We talk about why we came here, what our purpose was, what caused us to come here. That's called defining the lodge. We have defined the lodge. We have said to ourselves, here's why we're here, and here's what our jobs are. We focus the lodge. when the senior deacon opens the great lights, when he displays the Holy Bible, the square and compass, when we're led in prayer, when we have a scripture reading. We have focused the lodge on what our purpose is. And in fact, focusing the lodge unites us on our center of unity. And that is why we are here at that particular point. Our purpose in Masonry is, as our master opens us and he says, in the name of God and the Holy Saints John. We have focused our purpose, and that is service to the Almighty, service to the grand architect of the universe. The last thing that occurred, the fourth thing, is the master declared the lodge open. And he says, now we've done all the things that we needed to do to engage in our labors. We're open at this point. Our preparation is complete. And when you think about it, quite frankly, the opening ceremony of the lodge is the last step in preparing to assume the labors of the lodge. Hopefully, we've been preparing for lodge well before we come into this room. You know, many times we think of it in reverse. If opening the lodge is the last step of preparation, what's the step immediately before that? Being clothed. We put our aprons on. What's the step immediately before that? It's the time that we spend fellowshipping with each other when we first arrive. But what about before that? Part of the preparation for being in lodge is putting on our mental attitude of, I am ready now to go to lodge, to meet with my brothers and engage in the labor of the lodge. A master of the lodge certainly didn't start preparing for this meeting this morning. He's been preparing for this meeting for several weeks, maybe several months. The last thing that we do, the last step of our preparation, is open the lodge. And when the master declares the lodge open, we are ready to assume our labor at that particular point. Those are the surface meanings, the surface things that happen in our opening ceremony. So let's look at a couple of things that they represent, and these are the more esoteric meanings of our opening ceremony. Sealing the lodge. We have sealed the lodge from the outside world, from the profane world. When we conduct our opening ceremony, we have transitioned ourselves as a group from the profane world to the Masonic world, to the sacred world. We have passed through a transition at that particular point. So this building is a brick and mortar building, and you guys have done tremendous work on it. It's a nice building. It was a nice building to begin with. You've done a lot of work on it. You've made it even nicer. But it's just brick and mortar. As we go through these ceremonies, we transition out of the profane world and we transition into the Masonic world, into the sacred world. And that transition leads to a second thing that happens, and that is a transformation. This is not just a brick and mortar building now. This is a sacred space. When we open those great lights, when we invoke the name of the grand architect of the universe, this becomes a sacred space. We have asked the grand architect of the universe for his immediate presence here. And he is among us as we meet here this morning. We have transformed this room into a sacred space. And that, I think, is what we overlook most when we go through our opening and closing ceremonies. Transforming this room into a sacred space calls for a response from us. And I think there are three elements to that particular response. And the first element is engagement. Be present, be engaged, be in the moment. Put away your cell phone. Stop thinking about the profane world. Focus your energy and your effort and your mind here. Be in communion with your brothers. Be in communion with the grand architect of the universe. Give your best. The only acceptable response to being in the presence of the sacred, and indeed being in the presence of deity, is the presentation of the best we have to offer. And the only acceptable response is our best in our actions, in our deeds, in our words, in our appearance, in our approach to the way we practice Freemasonry. If we're not giving our best, we simply haven't engaged at that particular point. Masonry asks us our best. A man named Joseph Fort Newton was a great Masonic writer. He's also a great Protestant preacher. He wrote a book called The Men's House. And The Men's House was about the Masonic Lodge. And in The Men's House, he quoted a man named Thomas Huxley. Thomas Huxley was a British scientist. He was a botanist. And believe it or not, he offered up a fairly biblically supported defense of the theory of evolution. And Huxley's premise was that the theory of evolution wasn't contrary to the Bible. And he made a pretty good argument for that. But Huxley said and wrote in one of his books, it doesn't take much of a man to believe in God, but it takes all that he has. And think about that for a minute. To believe in God and to truly believe requires all of us. Requires all of our heart, all of our energy, all of our mind. Newton said you could say the same thing about Masonry. It doesn't take a great man to be a Mason, but it takes all of him. And that's that call for engagement. Give what you have. Give your talent. Give your all. Give your time. Give your best. Masonry has a single aim and purpose. It's to teach men to subjugate their passions and their desires, and in doing so improve themselves and achieve their full potential. Draw them closer to their Creator, the grand architect of the universe. Now, most of our lodges don't teach that fundamental truth, but several of our past Grand Masters have recognized the need for Kentucky Masons to be educated as to the genuine aim and purpose of Freemasonry. In 1958, William O. Ware, Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Research, for whom our research lodge is named, said these words, "It's my sincere hope that the future will disclose many Masons in this grand jurisdiction who will have responded to the need to become learned in the real meaning of Freemasonry. Then and only then can we expect Freemasonry in Kentucky to fulfill its intended purpose and become the beneficent spiritual power in the lives of each of us that it was destined to be." And brothers, I think that in and of itself tells us what our job is. What's the purpose of our opening ceremony and our closing ceremony? To focus us on the fact that this is a spiritual journey on which we have embarked. This is a spiritual process, and that's the purpose of our being here. Masonry has a single purpose, to teach men to subjugate their passions and desires. And note that word, subjugate. We subjugate our passions, we control our passions. We don't destroy them, we don't drive them away, but we learn to control them. The word passion comes from the Greek word pathos. It's a cause. What's the opposite of passion? Apathy. Apathy. We don't want men who are apathetic. We want men who have passions, but have learned to control those passions. And in controlling your passions and desires, we learn to approach the grand architect of the universe. Now, if that reality is not at the center of whatever activity it is that we're engaged in Masons, then what we're practicing isn't Masonry. If we're engaged in the practice of Masonry, and that is the act of improving ourselves, all of the attributes that we normally attribute to Freemasonry will appear, will occur. We'll practice charity, we'll practice fellowship, but those are attributes and they're not the center of our focus. Masonry has existed in organized form for over 300 years, and it continues to exist for one simple reason: it works. Lodges are transformed to a sacred place, and just as those lodges are transformed to a sacred place, there's a metaphor that's occurring here. What's that great line? I fumble through this. What is Masonry? It's a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbol. Another word for allegory is a metaphor. There's a metaphor that this opening ceremony stands for, and that metaphor is this: as we transition this lodge from the profane world to the sacred world, to the Masonic world, as we transform this building from an ordinary brick and mortar building to a sacred space, that's a metaphor for what ought to be occurring in our individual lives. We are transitioning out of the profane world and into a world where we have focused on improving ourselves. How do we improve ourselves? By learning to control our passions and desires. And we are transforming ourselves from this mortal realm in which we are to that spiritual realm, that house eternal in the heavens. The metaphor is, just as this building is transformed from a regular brick and mortar building into a sacred space, our lives are transformed into a spiritual temple as well. There's a parallel. What we do in our opening ceremony ought to be occurring in our lives also at the same time. Now, if that sounds intense, it's supposed to. Masonry is not a casual endeavor. It's serious work for serious men. And if you're unwilling to commit yourself to the lifelong practice of self-improvement and search for deity, you're in the wrong place. The last 60 years have seen the number of Masons in Kentucky drop from a high of slightly over 100,000 to our current level of about 29,000 members. And in that same period of time, we've seen a decrease in the same period of time that we have seen that decrease in membership, we have also seen a corresponding increase in the indifference to the moral lessons of Freemasonry inside and outside of Lodge, an increasingly casual approach to the practice of Freemasonry, and a lowering of our standards in areas of dress and ritual. Men become members of our lodge who have no interest in practicing Freemasonry. And many of those men have been elevated to leadership positions. We failed to teach the tenets of Freemasonry because so few members actually know what those tenets are. Because we have largely ignored the spiritual and philosophical foundations of Freemasonry, we've devolved into little more than just another social club. In these respects, our wounds are self-inflicted, but the good news is they can be self-healed. The last response for which we're called on is a commitment to excellence. Our commitment to excellence is not like the apron that we put on when we come to Lodge and remove when we leave. Our commitment to excellence is the tangible proof that we carry outside this Lodge that shows that we're pursuing excellence. Carrying it outside the Lodge is every bit as important as excellence inside the Lodge. In 1970, Grandmaster Carol Curtis, if you get the chance to meet Most Worshipful Brother Curtis, he's still with us and still active in Freemasonry. In his closing address to the Grand Lodge of Kentucky in 1970, Carol Curtis said, "Keep in mind that only high quality and excellence is acceptable to Freemasonry. It is of paramount importance that there be high quality in the moral standards, in practices of our members, in the leadership of our officers, in the dignified and impressive conferring of our degrees, and in the conducting of all of our ceremonies, and in the daily practice of our Masonic obligations and teachings. And then Most Worshipful Brother Curtis said, as Masons, we do not claim to be better than anyone else. And I think that's an important point to remember. We aren't claiming to be better than anyone. But he goes on to say, but in order to actually be Masons, there are certain standards that we must uphold. It's not our goal to be better than somebody. Our goal is to be better than ourselves. My job is to be a better man today than I was yesterday. But as Masons, we have obligated ourselves to upholding that standard of improvement. In fact, it's in the profane world that the practice of Freemasonry has its greatest benefit. As we improve ourselves, the society in which we live necessarily improves. Daily effort at self-improvement makes us better men. And that means we're better husbands, we're better fathers, we're better sons, we're better brothers, we're better bosses, we're better employees. Our quest for improvement, our commitment to excellence, is what sets us apart from the rest of the world and is the characteristic that makes Freemasonry unique. Now, just as our lodges have ritualistic opening ceremonies, we also have a ritualistic closing ceremony. And that closing ceremony is a mirror image of the opening ceremony. It's usually much shorter. If it took 6 minutes and 45 seconds to open the lodge, it probably takes 5 minutes maybe to close the lodge at most. But when we perform our closing ceremonies, we transform ourselves back. We transition back from the sacred world into the profane world. And this sacred space transforms itself back into a brick and mortar building. Just as the opening ceremonies are the last step in preparation for the labor of the lodge, the closing ceremonies are the first step in carrying Freemasonry outside the lodge. They remind us to take the lessons and precepts of Freemasonry with us. In the closing of the lodge, the closing ceremonies are the completion of a beautiful symmetry of Masonic ritual. And to bypass them is to leave our work unfinished. So I address this question to my Masonic brothers who are assembled here this morning. What happens in your Masonic lodge? Are your meetings ordinary events, merely just another gathering of men? Or is the dynamic presence of the great architect of the universe felt and experienced by those in attendance? What happens in your life? Is the transformation from the profane to the sacred apparent in your life? And the way you answer those questions will shape your individual future. Collectively, your answers will shape the future of this lodge, of your lodge. And those answers collectively, again, in part, will shape the future of the world in which we live. Freemasonry was not designed to be an ordinary experience. It wasn't meant for men who accept the ordinary. Freemasonry is an extraordinary experience, and it calls men to seek their greatest fulfillment. So what goes on in a Masonic lodge? When practiced in the manner in which it was intended, it's a transition from the profane world to the spiritual, and then back to the profane, hopefully strengthened and improved. It's a transformation from the ordinary world to the sacred, and then back to the ordinary, hopefully uplifted and inspired. The lodge becomes the place in which we, those of us who are fortunate enough to be called Masons, can engage in the most important work of our life, and indeed the most difficult work of our life, the construction of our spiritual temple, built with eternity in view. Worshipful Master, again, thank you for your invitation this morning.